Welcome back, everybody, to session two of day two of our virtual consult conference. I'm Ray Coulombe, Managing Director of Security Specifiers, and we are co-presenting, co-hosting virtual consult with the Security Industry Association. And here standing by with SIA is Jeff Cole. Jeff, please say hello.
Hey, good afternoon. This is Jeff from SIA. Myself and my colleague Sarah Schaefer here to kind of help Ray on the back end support, but also really thrilled to just wrap up that session earlier on OSDP. So looking forward to another great session here. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff and Sarah doing a great job behind the scenes of keeping things rolling here. So we appreciate that. So once again, Virtual Consult is brought to you by our primary sponsors, Altronics, our diamond sponsor, our gold sponsors, Acre, Intel, Linnell S2, and Salient Systems, all multi-year, enduring, and strong supporters of our consult concept. So thank all of you for sponsoring this. Once again, this is probably a repeat for most of you out there. Both Bixby and ASUS have approved this event. If you have not already sent me a certificate request, my email is ray@securityspecifiers.com. Give me a few days to turn the certificates. I will turn them as long as you're not logged in as anonymous. For today, if you're logged in for all sessions, Bixby will give you 3 CECs. It's all or nothing from Bixby. For ASUS, we can certify for each hour that you're on board. So please get those requests to me if you haven't done so. If you sent me a letter yesterday or earlier today, you don't need to do so again. Just one email to me is enough. The sessions will be recorded and live on SIA's website and Security Specifiers website, and probably our Attend Consult website as well. Again, give us a little bit of time to turn those. Questions should be submitted through the Q&A, but we're also monitoring the chat room. So please don't be bashful. It really lends another dynamic to this session and really enhances the presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce the session called Delivering Secure Identity. And this is sponsored by Allegion. Thank you, Allegion, for sponsoring this session. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Sal D'Agostino, President of ID Machines, to moderate this next session, which will wrap up at 3:15. Sal, take her away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate Ray the opportunity to moderate. This really great panel. So we're going to be looking at secure identity, which itself covers a far range. We're going to focus on the access control use case and basically what it means to be doing control in physical space for people and devices. And if you're going to be doing that, then often there's a number of steps that take place. There are identification, authentication, and authorization, which are in fact who you are, what you're allowed to do. The identification and authentication is really the who you are piece. That's what we're going to focus our talk on today. The other aspect of this, of course, is at what level of assurance or trust do you need for the identification and authentication to take place? And that's certainly something which needs to be considered. Usually, that's associated with a risk assessment of some kind, which results in fact into a requirement for some level of assurance around identification and authentication. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what all that means. But the focus here is going to be on the first two steps, authorization or Auth-C, which is when actual physical access control takes place, is a topic for another day. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Pierre Bourgex to take us down through. Excuse me. Before I do that, I think I'm certainly going to introduce my panel. Next will be Pierre Bourgex, who's in the bottom left there. But joining us also today is and Pierre is the CTO and founder at ESI Convergent, Consuelo Banks from Idemia, Hugo Wendling from Wavelength, and David York from Allegion. And I'm thrilled to get together, folks. Hello to all. Glad you're all here. Technology notwithstanding. All right, so I tried this once already. We'll give it another shot.
I'm going to let you control the slides, so go ahead and
yeah, that's fine.
the handoff.
So it's all yours, Pierre.
Sure. So fundamentally, the whole world is obviously being affected by a pandemic, and we're all looking to find out where this is all going to lead. Well, we obviously know that identity has become a major issue in regards to how to validate, right, that identity. And how do we create that identity is going to be the most intriguing part of this, right? We are going down the roads, of course, of facial recognition at the entry. We're looking at biometric. We're looking at a variety of different factors, two-factor authentication, card, biometric. There's products that are coming to the market that are forging their way into a new world, right? But the key is really to assure, what is an identity. And the validation of an identity has gone through a long process, right, in the access control environment. We saw the birth of ICAM, right, which was an industry standard, or at least attempted to become an industry standard over 10 years ago. FICAM on the federal mandate, right, to identify and define identity. And we use many different forms. We understood that, if we had a way to show that person who I was, right? We all understand that I had an actual identity that validated me. I used some form of reader that validated that card, right? The issue is that we go through this process, and unfortunately, authentication becomes an issue. How do we allow a person to validate the identity if really you could pass that card to someone else, right? I mean, this has been the struggle, right? And the part of that is that, we always thought that, hey, trust could be used. Well, there is no trust. So all of a sudden, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe longer, we created this concept of zero trust. Well, that sure throws a wrench into the concept of allowing somebody to be trustworthy, right? And so what we had to do is we had to create, create an identifier, uniqueness or a control method that allowed us to validate that identity. And so we started defining this and says, well, we could use multi-factor authentication. We could layer that authentication of that identity from the use of a card to the maybe an iris to a PIN. All of a sudden now we had a way to say, well, listen, that MFA could be used maybe not only in access control, but access control to everything, right? And that was the development of, the strength of the credential. How can we establish a token, a credential? But the issue is this, right? What's our biggest challenge? Our biggest challenge is that having adoption, right? Having the technology to be able to make that big leap to say, this works, this is reliable, this is something we can all depend upon. And I think that's why we're here today, right? We're here to learn about where we are today. What if we did we cross the Rubicon, a few years back and say, we've accomplished this. We're starting to get to that point. And then you throw in, and I mean, the frictionless concept. It's like all of a sudden now we got a pandemic. You get now a virus to be on top of the fact that, well, we had MFA and we have biometric, but do we keep it to the person, like say a biometric card, or is it, some form of a biometric or facial recognition at the entry, or is it, combined? If we're going to use some form of biometric, is that going to be authenticated at the door, right, at the access control reader? So the interesting part is what does it bind? How does it bind us? And again, here's the issue, right? If you really think about it, we've been talking about this for over 15 years, 20 years, in fact, longer than that potentially. But the reality is, in the reality of where we are today versus where we are in the next say, step of our evolution is do we have the proper technology to do it? And then here's the other part. Do we have the consent to allow the use of biometric, right, or facial recognition in the process of entry? So we all say that, well, listen, you gave him a credential, he's able to use it, he's able to use his face. But the reality is that how do we use that information? How do we use that data? Where's the actual delineation between the viability of you versus the viability of what you can use as you? So I would say, ability to control identity and credential lifecycle, that's going to be the biggest question is how valid is it to keep that PII, that information? And are we in a position where we have to give up some of our rights, our civil liberties, to allow this access control, this new world of identity to become real and work for all of us? It's fascinating, right? We're all in that point of no return. And I think MFA now being used in virtually every environment, I can tell you right now, it's here, it's going to last forever. In our world, we don't have much of a choice because, frankly, to release that, we always said the PKI was released, and therefore we get to use a trusted identity. Well, unless you have some form of consent, you have built-in consent into that process. I mean, Sal's been doing a great job with that over time. That's a big part of where NIST is going. Zero Trust 800-207. Read about the concepts of where that's really integrated into the converged approach, from access reader all the way through to the process of using it in the IT and OT realm. And what does the specification include? What are we defining and in terms of the use of identity, and how are we going to ensure that the protections are there and that we're not passing liability to someone else? And that's going to be the big struggle of conversation that we're all going to face, because frankly, the two parts of this story that we're already talking about, people and process, the real big question is technology. And really, at the end of the day, this is the model. We went from level of assurance, which is basically in effect a one-dimensional approach. Now we really have defined where FICAM and ICAM were created, but getting it to a more robust. It's not just a checkbox anymore. You actually have to prove that you can do what you do. And at the end of the day, if we cannot get to that point, then really it's the vetting of technology that's going to be the key to this story. So people, processes are going to be the key to the actual validation of say NIST and what they've accomplished, and where we can identify how we get to a federated system. And this is not just, before it was like, when we say federated, we went, oh, that's only for the enterprise. Frankly, and that's not true. I think, frankly, we're all going to reach a point where we have to validate the fact that identity is, access identity entry is the key factor to the future of our world, and how we define it.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the entry to the next discussion in regards to how we take from, the identity assurance levels of and robustness of how we define identity, how we authenticate identity, and how we assure identity. And the assurance level really leads to really the rest of the panel today. And I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody comes up with and the ideas that they have to make that a reality for all of us. Go ahead, Sal.
Well, thanks, Pierre. All right. Well, then, now we're on to David York to try to get us to the point where, after Pierre has given us, as I introduced this, that actually it's a broad topic when you talk about secure identity, to try to boil this down to something that you actually might specify for a use case. David, over to you.
Yeah. So Pierre did a great job of setting the table. And as we narrow this down and we start to say, okay, trust is what matters. I mean, access is built on trust, and it's tough to, confirm trust or have a trusting relationship without very clear identity that we know is going to persist throughout the relationship. And so that seems kind of tough. And how do we get that down to this building or this organization that I'm going to specify some solutions into. And I think it starts by kind of narrowing it down and really understanding your use cases. Pierre mentioned process, and a lot of times the use cases have a process that we might be able to leverage. And we're seeing more of this where, in say a hospital or a university, the people that we're going to, assign an identifier to and have them use it and govern their access across that organization or that building or that campus, what can we start with there? And a lot of it is, registration to a school or onboarding employees. Those are things that go through a lot of rigor and have some process to say, yep, that identity is assured, and we can build trust off of that identity. And from there, also, potentially partnering with an existing organization like HR. You can build more constructs to say, how do we want to build this access model, and how do we specify those things in as well too. And so I think that's where we see, not just understanding our use cases, but our use cases will drive what we have to work with. And then the use cases also start to specify the physical elements. And that's where the people start to integrate with the physical. And they move around, they have to have access, they need to be, monitored for proper behaviors and things like that. And that's where I think the data starts to get into, how do we move through this life cycle? It's a lot of times it's focused mostly on how do I get someone registered? How do I issue the identifier, the credential that they're going to use? But there's an entire life cycle, and oftentimes those mirror other business processes, like the onboarding of an employee who changes roles, who changes jobs, might need different access to different things, and ultimately exits the organization. And so these are some of the things that I would say we need to take into consideration. Other elements too, as Pierre mentioned, when we start talking about leveraging maybe existing standards in the industry, or zero trust, and how when you think about zero trust, you've got to look all the way up and down your supply chain to make sure that every element of your solution is trustworthy, not just the creation of the identity and the access model. Let's go on to the next slide there. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that we can do to assure identity, and that's really what the trust models are built on. And these are just a few of the examples that we can think about as we bring people into the equation, and we actually start to satisfy the use cases that we're trying to specify solutions for. As I think about it, being in a CISO role and more on the IT side of things, but working for a company that's on the physical side of things, it's an interesting dynamic. And where I think those two worlds have met and are going to continue to meet and thrive together is knowing how they can leverage each other. There are a lot of lessons in the digital or the IT side of things that can really overlay or translate well into the physical side. And that's bringing all the different components together kind of into a common solution and understanding, where people are throughout their day-to-day activities. Other things that I think are important for specifications is as you move into, the physical security onto an IP network or into more of a traditional or conventional IT environment, you are going to get data from HR systems potentially. You may have to feed data back to other systems, and data moves around networks. So it's always good to know who your network owner is and get good relationships with the people where your solutions are going to be deployed. Sal, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. All right. Well, next up, we have Hugo, if you're ready to step forward and take us through the identifier and authentication assurance aspect of this talk this afternoon, as the case may be.
Thank you. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about credentials and access control readers. This is what my company does, and that's what my life focus is really on. Assuring the identity is essentially achieved at the access point with a credential and a reader. That's the traditional method today. The context here is to try to realize the transition into a credential that meets the identity assurance specifications. So often you run into constraints of the credential not meeting these requirements. And almost in every case, the end user tries to transition from an existing legacy installation into a new system. So if you look at key management as it relates to access control, it's important to engage with vendors that can provide effective key management, certificate management, and it's important to understand the limit of the solutions that they provide. The end user will typically define a set of requirements, and in almost all cases, the end user is going to require the ownership of the certificates and the keys. So that's an essential shift in what we are seeing today. The end user is now very much aware of the limitations of legacy solutions, and therefore is requiring this transition into complete ownership of the security. So, as a consultant, I think it's important to avoid the pitfalls of solutions that don't offer transparent key management, for instance. So, beyond just the interoperability of standards and so on, I think it's important to focus on the credential itself, the ownership of that credential, and the keys and the certificates behind it.
And Hugo, what about the people that say, I don't want to deal with key management, that's too much for me, I don't even know what that is. I know it's important, but right now, I don't have to do it, because there is no keys in some of this stuff, old stuff.
Right.
There are no keys. Sorry. And besides that, sort of, what percentage of the people that you're doing business with actually recognize and you benefit from the fact that they proactively want? So, I mean, how much is it to the point where people are proactively coming to you because they know they have that option for that at this point? Or is it still the case that we need to be educating people that they have the option to control their own keys? And then the follow-up to that is, what does that mean? I don't know how to do that. Isn't that a hard thing to do? And maybe I don't even want to get into it.
This is a great question. Well, this is very philosophical in my mind. The vast majority of end users that I deal with directly, that I have interactions with directly, are end users that know security, they understand security, and they are in the midst of implementing policies that require a security upgrade. So this is the pool of customers that absolutely know what they want. But the standard end user isn't necessarily somebody that wants to bother with security audits and vendor qualification processes that they frankly can't afford. As an industry, though, it's important for us to continue to push the evolution of this trend and to guarantee that we continue to give the ability to all end users to migrate into truly secured and interoperable technologies. Hopefully I answered your question.
No, thanks. You have. I mean, the option exists, and some people get it. Others, I mean, like the migration to anything, it takes place in phases. But it does seem that enough people understand that we're actually in the security business, and that they should be delivering secure systems and not vulnerabilities. Is probably a little bit more prevalent than it has in the past. Okay, so and so yeah, so a little bit of background on what makes up the strong stuff here. So please.
Yeah, I'll try to give some examples here that are probably relevant to this slide. If you take a step back for a second and look at what the end user absolutely wants, that is very basic. It's very simple. They want security, they want interoperability, and most often they also want a defined transition away from their legacy system. So they need to upgrade to achieve certain security requirements. Identity management is almost always part of that. In order to do so, they have to go through the vetting of readers and credentials for access control. What's happening in the previous session here, the topic was the discussion of OSDP. What OSDP means to the industry and to this new generation of end users is the fact that a reader is now a managed edge device. So when a reader is connected two-way to a controller, that device becomes fully intelligent and fully connected. So obviously using standards to achieve this type of interoperability and this connectivity is always best practice. So this is on the reader side. On the credential side, you're running into the same requirements in terms of security. What you look at today is whether or not your credential has the full ability to be secured. And that really means whether it's a piece of plastic or a mobile solution, does it employ a secure element? So that's a key point, because a secure element really means that your credential now can afford to communicate securely and to always provide authentic data. So it gives the assurance that the identity is true. You essentially cannot guarantee any of it without a secure element in your device. So this includes a slew of credentials available today. Technologies like Desfire, for instance, is by definition a secure element. You find secure elements in mobile devices, not all of them today, but it's becoming more and more prevalent. The device manufacturers like Apple and others are starting to require that secure element. It is indeed used to do payments. So you see Google Pay and Apple Pay as becoming more and more mainstream. That same technology needs to be used for access control.
I think, let me add one thing to what you just said. And I think one of the confusions for many people is the fact that we can't speak to access control as a one-dimensional element anymore. We are multidimensional, and practice becoming part of the process of defining it in the realm of IT and OT. And I think that the reality is that's where everybody is, the confluence of rivers of processes and people lie in the use of technology in all those areas. And OSDP is that gateway, of course, for access control. But I think identity and the process of identity and the use of how we, take the premise built by many of the standards that have been created is how we are going to really take us to the next level. And I think the questions I'm seeing, being like Ray Navarro is exactly correct. I mean, we're in that point where, you not only have to vet the process, you have to identify the process into what it's being used for and who the identity is based upon. So right on target and from the access control platform, but I think we have to also realize it's expanding the horizons of how it's used.
Yep, that's exactly correct. And to add to this, as Ray is asking, you're looking at functionality today that is very much limited by the technology and the available devices. And I'll touch on a couple of points, but an interesting point was, I had an end user reach out to me and say, "Hey, Hugo, can I do contact tracing with my access control credential?" So, their internal belief was, let's just expand our access control badge to do contact tracing throughout the corporation. These types of requests are not possible. You run into requirements that are simply not feasible. And so understanding what is real and what isn't is absolutely vital. A bit of the same the same topic but different technology is Bluetooth. Bluetooth, as it exists today, is essentially a consumer interface. It's very useful to use and to listen to music, but it's not great for access control. And everybody on the panel here knows this, and everybody listening in probably knows it also. The adoption has been very difficult, and the support has been tremendous. The reason being, the transaction is not guaranteed at the door. Bluetooth is possibly prone to relay attacks, for example. And the Bluetooth stack is controlled by the operating system of the mobile device, meaning that at any point, Google or Apple can decide to no longer give you access to that interface for your mobile application. So, and to add to this, the enterprise end user has tried to implement a Bluetooth credential, and in general has failed to do so. In fact, I'm not aware of any single entity that's using Bluetooth as their standard access control credential. So to expand on this, again, everything wraps back to this secure element discussion. And we know that the future is absolutely mobile. Mobile devices are continuing to evolve, and they provide secure connectivity and secure elements today, but it is mostly restricted to the usage of payment. So again, Google Pay, Apple Pay. NFC, I believe, is a wonderful interface as it guarantees the end user intent to access. So this allows for very strong security at the reader point. So you're looking at 2 or 3 years perhaps until NFC becomes mainstream, and it will absolutely get there. The integrations are taking place, the technology is evolving, and mobile will become the mainstream credential. But as it is today, I think it's important to realize that Bluetooth isn't going to meet the enterprise access control requirements. That was perhaps a side note, but I think it's very important here as it relates to security.
It's actually part of a table. It's an item for discussion in the table in the next slide.
Yes. Maybe perhaps we should go to the next slide then.
Yeah, exactly. If I can make sure I'm on the right screen here. So in trying to put together a spec, I mean, this is one that we've worked with for a while, and Hugo, I guess you get to go through it. But it just brings together a series of standards and best practice. And yeah, so it's all yours. And okay. I guess you're going to take again, I mean, we've been talking a little bit about cards and readers and mobile. But you're going to do the first few columns, and then we're going to share the last 3 columns with Pierre, myself, and some others.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, we've been talking about credentials, and we've been talking about mobile, and what's acceptable today is summarized in these tables. I myself personally very much look forward to have a complete transition into the mobile space. I believe that plastic will completely vanish over the next decade. So, Sal, I don't know. I think I've covered the mobile topic and
Yeah, no, I think that's also an interesting point to make, right? I see everybody doing it.
Yeah, but I'm not completely on board with the concept, only because enterprises have a difficulty, and I think this is the Rubicon that we talk about in terms of the how do we cross it from trust. We have a device that's personally mandated, and you have a credential that is privately mandated by the corporation. So I'm not disagreeing with the premise, but again, as we're panelists, we're going to dispute some of the concepts of the attrition rate of mobile, or the attrition rate, of cards. So,
but that's the thing about making a comment and saying over the next decade. It's hard today to ever say that it.
Yes.
um,
but perhaps this brings us back to the original discussion of the OSDP reader. This is truly an edge device that will continue to evolve. And, if you're going to install a reader today, it better be OSDP, it better be connected, it better be secured, and have the ability to be upgraded at any point during its life cycle. If the technology evolves, you want your reader to evolve and not have to replace it.
And Hugo, are you saying that, in the case of NFC, because of the radios that are in readers, that the current reader technology is very much NFC ready, so to speak? Or, or is there a difference between, reading something in those frequencies and actually doing NFC? Just from a migration perspective for people who've got readers on the wall. Any thoughts about that?
Great question. So all readers today that support DESFire and other ISO 14443 credentials will support NFC in the future. Hopefully their secure element will support the security side of the design, but the connectivity over the NFC interface will be the same.
All right. So the radio is no problem. It's a question whether the secure element supports the sufficient crypto, so to speak.
Correct. So your reader needs to be equipped with a secure element to perhaps function with an NFC device in the future, or perhaps it's all going to be PKI based, in which case the reader itself becomes transparent. However, you absolutely need two-way communication to the other side of the wall through the wire in order to maintain that security and that functionality. So therefore, I very much preach the open standard of OSDP. And a quick note on that standard. It has evolved in a beautiful way. It's an absolutely excellent spec. It's important that the vendor product meets that spec and is fully vetted as well.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you, Hugo, for being one of the early adopters of it and Wavelength's support for the program and the spec through time. It's certainly making progress, which is a nice thing to see. There's also a comment, just a quick brief in the chat where someone's talking about bio and OSDP. Again, there's an OSDP bio profile. And so that's true that there are no readers currently, no devices have currently been certified to that profile. There is an application for one, for what it's worth. I can say that, I guess. So like all things, these things take time. I know a number of biometric vendors who are certainly working with OSDP. So to the point in chat. Yeah, what about the rest of the slide? So, I mean, Hugo's gone over it now. I mean, the point is that you should have a secure element, I mean, throughout in the card, in the device, in the reader, and it should be doing modern crypto, right? I mean, that's kind of the point of those first three
Yeah,
columns.
I think we have to be, I think from the consulting standpoint, I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, yes, we agree. OSTP is definitely a specification that is absolutely, it's a future-proof concept, right? I mean, you've developed it based on on proper standards. The question mark becomes, when you have a client who, is posed with many challenges based upon legacy infrastructure. And based upon that, the specification has to be able to be slightly addresses the security at the edge and security at the reader and to the panel. So many cases, we're still in the process of dealing with the fact that there are certain manufacturers that are not on board yet, and there's a transition that has to take place. But, and the big but is, no matter what, this is an educational process with the client, and it is an educational process in terms of what the manufacturer must join and how it must join. So I think that we're in that position where we have to do this, and I think that's a critical concern. I think one thing that I think Consuelo would really pose a really good segue to this conversation, because I think when it comes to IT and OT, and how that converged standard or the converged specification takes place, we must understand the IT infrastructure, and we must understand how it's going to play a role in putting this entire package together, right, for the end user as well as for the integrator. And so for me, it's I want the specification to include that understanding, because you can really get yourself in a hole if you're not really specifying things with a full understanding of what that framework looks like, or that architecture looks like. So,
Yeah.
long and the short of it, I mean, I want to lead to the fact that it's critical. OSTP is critical, but please just make sure that when you're implementing a specification, it includes the framework as a whole for the organization, and understands how its use is and how it's established in regards to people, process, and technology as a whole. So anyway, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of points in this table. It calls out a specific OSTP profile, which is the way that the verified program works. There's also the point of being very specific about whether or not it currently supports the file transfer functionality, because that's the piece which gives you the bidirectional communications, allows it to be fully managed as an edge device. So if you're specifying those systems, it's important to know that capability. Those are the things that you want to be asking to your supplier that the device supports, right? That's true for both the PD, the reader, and the ACU, the controller. And besides that, you've got to, the other thing that we haven't touched on here is making sure that the devices themselves, like when it comes to IP, whether it be camera, controller, intercom, or whatever, uses certificates, does TLS properly, does proper device authentication, is a real thing that can live on a modern network, which uses modern tools to monitor the devices and manage the devices on the network. So being able to use SNMP to manage the device, or being able to scan things to know that they're there, being able to, physical, I think physical security devices are IoT devices, and IoT devices, if they're going to be IP devices, need to be managed securely. And so those are kind of the baseline. TLS is kind of a baseline requirement, and you should not be, and you should be using a valid certificate and have it up to date.
Consuelo, what's your position on this? We've talked a lot about it, and now it's your turn.
Okay. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the issue of securing the communication channel using TLS 1.2 upwards to 1.3 is critical. Not only from the perspective of the fact that your access control system is existing in an ecosystem, a network ecosystem today. You're also, especially if you're implementing biometrics, you're transporting personally identifiable information from one place to another, from either a controller to a reader, an edge device, or from a back-end enrollment software to the edge device. So protecting that channel becomes critical. And OSDP secure channel plays a key role in there, as well as the Ethernet, Internet, TCP/IP, TLS 1.2. The other point to this, and I think you may want to, I don't know if you have another slide to go to, Sal, is laws. The many states now are enacting biometric protection laws. Illinois was the first in 2008. They were the first to address the collection of biometric data and basically included 5 tenets that you must obtain consent prior to collection of any biometric. It has to be informed consent. What is the biometric being used for? How is it being stored? Who has access to it? How long are we keeping it? It prohibits profiting off biometric data. It allows only a limited rights to disclose that data, and it sets the actual protection obligations and data retentions. Plus, this law has teeth. If an individual has provided their biometrics and did not give consent, or the biometrics were used in a way that they had not, that individual had authorized, they now can actually bring lawsuits to the company that's using that data. Texas enacted a biometric Information Protection Act in 2009, but it's different. It doesn't cover data that is converted into a code or template. It does require notice and consent, but it doesn't require a written release. In today's COVID world, you've got businesses now that are implementing methods to capture temperature. They're using infrared scanning technology as their employees or consumers, customers go through the front doors. Well, in Illinois, that's illegal unless you have written consent from the consumer, from the store patrons. So the capture of temperature isn't covered on the law, but the fact that you're scanning the face is. So it starts to get kind of complicated, and you really have to be cognizant of what the state law is that you're going to be operating in. Washington State is another one. They enacted a law in 2017. Like the others, it covers biometric measurements, but it only defines biometric information as data generated by automatic measurements of an individual's biological characteristics. Arkansas, they jumped into the fray here. And again, they define biometric data as generated by automated measurements of an individual's biometric biological characteristics also. So most of these states do not have a financial component if the regulations are not followed. It's more a sanction by the state legislature or the state attorney. So as a result, your security systems that use biometrics must include processes for active consent and permission to use biometrics day to day, or provide an opt-out policy. So now this means your edge device, your biometric device, has to be able to support, for example, card and biometrics, as well as card and PIN. You don't want to use card only. I mean, cards can be lost, transferred. PIN only can be transferred, forgotten. So you need at least two-factor authentication. Security systems today have to provide support of that hard copy or that digital record, maybe using a signature pad, that the individual did consent. Interestingly enough, recently, IDEMIA has been asked to add an additional feature where even though, so the access control system is managing the collection of the consent documents and the signature, but as an additional protection, they want the biometric hardware to ask the question again, right at the point where the biometric is being collected. And because
Well, that's actually the case, right? The whole problem is that surveillance typically occurs, well, is actually underway. And then you're asking an individual for consent when they're already under surveillance. So yeah, I say, which is,
Right.
you think, which almost by default breaks all the laws, because that means that surveillance is already taking place and there hasn't been given notice. And so
that's not so much.
in many cases, right, and certainly online, Consuelo, right?
Yes, absolutely. So what they're really saying is, at the point where you're capturing that biometric, you ask the question, do you consent? And if the person says no, you immediately shut that device down.
Yep.
But it's got to be in the context of the workflow. So you're being enrolled in the access control system, and now you're doing a biometric enrollment. So the intent there, Sal, is during the enrollment in the access control system.
It has to be at the very, 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 very beginning of the process, without question.
Correct.
I think
So.
No. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So protecting biometric data, again, you've got to have that encrypted capability. Encryption when the data is at rest, a minimum of AES 256, because biometrics either are stored on the device, or they're stored in a back-end enrollment software, or on the card. And to Hugo's point, your card has to have some protection there. And that key management becomes important, because you use that key to decrypt the biometric template that's on the card. Even prior to that, you want to use that key to do mutual authentication between the biometric device and the card itself. And then the next piece is decrypting the template on the card within the biometric device versus on the card. So it's all done in a secure manner. The other piece here is what we're finding in really high security conscious organizations. They require yearly changes in the PKI certificates that are used to authenticate devices that are communicating to each other. So if you think this through, you've got a biometric device authenticating to the control panel through OSTP secure channel. You have a biometric device authenticating back to an enrollment software. You could have hundreds of these devices in your enterprise. How do you manage that? And that's a challenge we're facing right now. And in looking at, okay, how do we create using open standards like SAML, SAML, to communicate to a third party that customer uses, that's trusted, to refresh, reuse, reissue these certificates. Global companies not only have to pay attention to the state laws, but they also have to pay attention to global laws, such as the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. So all of these issues come to play, spelling out how biometrics are collected, protected, stored, who has access, what's your data retention policy, and how are you really getting rid of them. Right. Consumers are, to your point earlier about mobile credentials, are demanding more mobile credentials. Using your cell phone for access control in place of a card. Using a virtual identity stored on your phone for financial transactions, storing your driver's license on your phone. So it's establishing a digital identity associated with some kind of physical credential. And that process, as was mentioned before, starts with the issuing authority, who already performed the identity proofing, managing the breeder documents, establishing the identity chain of trust from the initial collection of those proofing and breeder documents down to the biometric collected from the individual. That association has to be protected through PKI, digital signatures, providing assurance that the data collected hasn't been altered since it was initially connected, and it can be trusted for providing mutual authentication. This transferring of a digital credential from one element to your phone, again, requires that secure communication channel. And once that digital identity or element is in the phone, it's got to be in an area that's not easily accessible. So you then have to have a secure communication between the relying party that wants to use and verify that credential and the entity that actually created that credential in the first place, that digital identity in the first place. So it's a three-legged stool. All three have to have a secure communication process, providing ideally a federated assurance level, which would describe the requirements for how that information is obtained from the identity provider. So I've got my cell phone, a policeman stops me. First, the policeman wants to verify my credential on my phone. And in doing that, that policeman's mobile phone has to connect securely back to, again, some entity that actually issued that driver's license, as an example. So it's extremely important to not just biometrically link the individual to the identification documents, but it's also to provide those digital signatures and the PKI, the certificate checking and verification that says I'm allowed to talk to you. One device is allowed to talk to another. He is allowed to share that credential.
I want to add
Oh,
one.
Pierre, excuse me, just 1 second. I just want to remind the panel, we have about 2 minutes left here.
Yep, this is
Conclusion.
we're-
So, Dale?
Yeah, no, other than this, there's a list of references that are coming up. Thanks, Ray. So yeah, so the mobile driver's license there actually is something which is coming forward. There is an ISO standard, which leads us into sort of a last slide that we have. And Ray, I guess people can get these links. There are hyperlinks there. I don't know how we get those out to your population, but I'm sure we can work on that.
Yeah, we're going to make the slides available probably on the websites, if not on request.
Oh, great. And then, so these are there for you. Just sort of cherry picked a few. You want to get advanced, I even threw post-quantum crypto. You want to make your stuff really safe.
I'm working
That's tongue in cheek. That's kind of an Easter egg among the others there. I want to thank everybody for today. Thank you very much. The next session, which is coming up, is the impact on privacy laws. I mean, we're talking quite a lot about those here. And so, that's following up. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, no, there is a very sympathetic and necessary relationship between privacy and security, and identity is certainly right in the intersection of those things. So looking forward to the rest of Consult. This has been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sal. And Consuelo, I think your comments lead very nicely into our next session, where the requirements of privacy laws squarely butt heads with the needs of access control. We've got a great panel to deal with just that. So thank you very much, panel.